Welcome all of you. Glad to see you. Bernadette McCauley. Bernadette's friends get to call her Bunny, so I get to call her Bunny too. Dr. McCauley is a professor emerita of history from Hunter College of the City University of New York. Her research examines the intersection of the history of Catholics, immigrants, medicine, and social welfare, and women in the United States, as we'll hear today. Her published work includes her 2005 book, Who Shall Take Care of Our Sick?, as well as her very important lesson called Apart and Among in the collection entitled Catholics in New York, which was published in 2008. She has published gazillions of articles in American Magazine, American Catholic Studies, Culture Front, the Journal of Urban History, the Journal of the History of Medicine and Allied Sciences, and the New Irish History. Welcome, Dr. McCauley.
Well, thank you. And thank you for referring to me as the main event. That's something. Thank you very much for inviting me, Mark. And thank you to Maddie and Suze, who's outside, for setting this up so nicely and making it so easy. Thank you all for being here. I'm really grateful. I am emerita, so I'm not in an academic environment. And let's just say, coffee after Pilates is not really a venue to talk about my research. So I'm glad to be here, and I'm really looking forward to your comments. This is a work in progress, so I'm open to suggestions. And frankly, I'd like to finish it. Right, Mark? Yes, he keeps telling me that. Are you done? I want to be done. Okay. So this project didn't start in, a traditional way. How do historical projects start? Usually with a question or an archive, something you'd like to examine. No. It started with a book. I don't even recall. I read a review somewhere of a book written by a former sister. And I thought, I'd like to give that a look at it. So I ordered it on Amazon. Well, when you order on Amazon, they say at the bottom, you might be interested in, right? Well, okay, so 2 more crop up, and I think, okay. Well, as I kept ordering them, it kept increasing. Well, you might like this, you might like this, you might like this. So then I decided, well, I'm going to go after this in a different sort of way. So every week I would plug in ex-nun to Amazon, and don't you know, they kept coming. And I still do it. It's not quite as frequent, but they are still coming, which is something interesting. I don't know the phenomenon, but if you know publishing, it's not like they're being published right now, but for some reason they're on Amazon. If you see what I mean, they've been published 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I don't know, but then they just become available to Amazon. In any case, I have in my possession, and hopefully in my head, over 50 memoirs written by former sisters that have been published since 2000. I haven't been working on this since 2000. Sometimes it seems like that, but no, more recently. So, as Mark can tell us, ex-nun narratives are nothing new in U.S. history or literature. In the 19th century, there was a slew of them, also into the early 20th century, but they weren't real. They were written by people who wanted to, they were phony exposés of what went on in convents. Very lurid. I mean, one historian suggests that really it was pornography. It was more pornography than anti-Catholicism because if you read what was going on in those convents. But much more recently, ex-nun narratives have been popular. In the immediate period after the Second World War, there were 2 in particular. One called I Leap Over the Wall. That was written by an English woman, Monica Baldwin, but it was very popular here. It was published several times, reprinted. You might know the movie. Vivian Leigh played Monica, and she had been in a cloistered convent for I think 28 years. So that book is very much that, wow, look what's happened in the world since I've been here, you know. It's actually very good in terms of post-war Britain, if you're interested, just to see, you know, how the war. Anyway, another one that you might be familiar with is the Nuns story, which was a fictionalized version of the life of a Belgian nun who goes off to the Congo, Sister Luke. And again, a very popular movie with Audrey Hepburn, who I think still remains like the visual, right, of, you know, the nun story. But even more recently, in the late 1970s, there was a slew of, well, I won't say a slew, a good number, maybe 10, 8 to 10, memoirs written by women who were part of what is often referred to as the exodus from American convents in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And that was a massive leave-taking. Women had always left the convent in the past. There's a process for leaving a convent, or leaving a religious community, I should say. But these numbers were very different. Just to give you an idea, in 1965, the estimate is there are almost 180,000 women living in American convents as sisters and nuns.
Could you put the difference between those two examples?
I was just going to do that.
She's ahead of me, but I'm not surprised.
Questions at the end, please. Raise your hand. So the difference is, you know, we refer to all women religious, which is the contemporary term, as nuns. But nuns are women who take what are called solemn vows and live separately in a cloistered environment. But we use the term nun pretty commonly to describe any woman living in a religious community. Anyway, so the numbers, okay. In 1975, numbers are down to about 135,000. And I always like to note this. The numbers don't go down immediately after the Second Vatican Council. All right, I think that that's a common misperception that Vatican II came and, no, as a matter of fact, there was a little upsurge that, oh, this is going to be different now, you know. So, but the numbers continue to decline. And it's not because of deaths. It's because women are leaving, and at the same time, less women are entering convents. So now in 2022 is the most recent, about 42,000 women, and it's a really elderly population. The average age is 80 among women religious today. Okay, so the women who are writing these 50 memoirs, all right, their books differ from the ones that women wrote in the immediate aftermath or during the Exodus. Those books, not surprisingly, right, there's an immediacy to them. You know, this is what's happening now, right? And they're also part of a larger conversation about what's happening in convents and in the church. I mean, sociologists, psychologists, clergy, you know, people are chiming in on why this happened and what it means for the church. So they're part of that conversation. These newer books have a very different perspective. Many of the authors have been out of the convent longer than they were in the convent, you know? So the convent is one part of a life that they're telling in these books. They've waited a very long time to tell their story, and that's my first question. Why did they wait so long, right, to do this? They're also very different in a technical, mechanical, I don't know what the right term would be, in that they're self-published, overwhelmingly self-published. So they're part of the new phenomenon, right, of self-publishing. And what does that mean? Well, there's very little editing, and there isn't the standard checks of veracity that publishing houses are supposed to do. All right, disclaimer there. We know that doesn't always work. There have some very highly publicized examples of memoirs that just ain't true, right? So that doesn't always work, but still, I think it's worth noting. And maybe more to the point is the no editing, and I don't mean that in, how it reads. I mean in terms of what's in it or not. An editor says, well, you didn't say enough here, or say more here. There isn't that. They're saying what they want to say, I think they're more like oral histories than memoirs, They're like an open-ended oral history where, if any of you have ever done oral history, you just let the person talk. It's really not a question-answer interview. It's tell me, where you went to school and what it was like. And then when the person finishes, you give them the transcript and they can take out whatever they don't want in there. So I think these books are much more like that. I kind of gave myself a crash course in memoir and memory when I became involved in this. So I think some people would call these life writings rather than memoir. That's a very old 17th century term, but it came into fashion in the lit crit business in the end of the 20th century. So life writings, narratives, rather than autobiography or memoir. So in all that reading, I took away a few tips, rejected a few as well. The whole memory literature, you can get really bogged down in that. But I was particularly influenced by a collection of writings by Vietnam veterans that was analyzed by a historian. His name is John Woods. And he didn't look to use those writings as examples of soldiers' experiences. Right? So he wasn't using them as, this is what happened when, during the Tet Offensive to me. What he said, and I'm paraphrasing him, is what he wanted to do, and I think he did it very well, is analyze what the authors said and how and why they said it. So I took a cue from him. So I'm not, in other words, reading these books as documentary evidence of convent life. They certainly can be used like that, and if you've read Brian Titley's book, I never know how to say his name, Titley, Into Silence and Servitude, he in fact uses some of these books. But he uses them, as you would have to, with corroboration. So if someone describes an event, that occurred to them in the convent, you need other evidence to do that. But I'm not using them that way. Okay. I'm working on what they've chosen to say after all these decades, and why they're doing it. Okay, so some data. All right, let's start with that, on the authors. They grew up and entered the convent in the decades surrounding World War II, mostly out of high school, although in some cases as high school students. That was a special category called an aspirant. I don't know, I don't have any evidence on this, but it seems to me that was more popular in the Midwest. It wasn't like an East Coast thing as much. And those women would attend high school as a nun in training. So there are some of those. With one exception, all the memoirists, authors, are white. That one exception, you may know of her, she sued Whoopi Goldberg because she said that Whoopi stole her book for Sister Act. I'm not quite sure. I think it's still in the courts. Anyway. The authors overwhelmingly enter what are referred to as active orders, to go back to that distinction between sister and nun. These are not cloistered women. They worked outside their convents. And finally, they all left the religious life voluntarily. while they call and promote their narratives as those of an ex-nun, and that term, by definition, emphasizes their leaving, right? They write much more than that, okay? They choose to recount their experiences as a sister and their leave-taking within a much larger landscape. And so, although they say this is the story of an ex-nun, it's more than, of course it is because they are ex-nuns, but the story that they tell is of a much broader life. But they do focus on the convent, all right, and spend quite a bit of time. Convent rituals and language, a couple of them even have glossaries, it'll say active, cloistered, all the different, pieces of the habit, so people can look that up. They often recount their experiences from the perspective of their perspective as a young person going into the convent. So you're brought into the learning of it as they learned of it, of the moment, the process of becoming a sister as a postulant and then a novice. Those are the two stages of training. Postulant being the first days, right? Arrival. And then there's a period where the postulant is learning a little bit about the life, but the sisters, the professed sisters, are observing her to see whether or not she's going to be a good fit for the community. If the decision is yes, then she will be received into the community as a novice and enter the novitiate. So there's quite a bit in these books about all of that. Here's one, just a quote from one. There were so many questions to ask and so much to learn, and that's what the authors take us through. They recount incidents, meals, events, socialization. They emphasize the ceremonial aspects and the steps leading up to be accepted as a member of the community. The cutting of the hair, receiving the habit, the different pieces of the habit, the procession as brides of Christ. Many reference the term brides of Christ and consider what it meant to them. One. When I joined my hands, placing my fingertips under my chin, I didn't feel so much like a small girl about to receive her communion. I was, after all, a grown woman on her way to becoming a bride of Christ. I felt beautiful, even glamorous. Another. When you become a bride of Christ, no human mediator intervened between the soul and Jesus. What could be better, purer, more dramatic? Another, couldn't wait to become a bride of Christ. I have vivid memories of the night before the ceremony. I wanted to have everything perfect. This was the ultimate. It was marriage to Christ. The novitiate period is partially spent cloistered, where as student nuns, they are within a class. I'm going to call them a class. They're a novitiate group. And they do not have contact with the larger community or the world outside. It's a very closed and indeed, I would say, intimate experience. I want to say more about that. The writings aren't as explicit about that as they are on some other aspects, but there are indications of how critical it was to them. It's here that you start, that the authors mention personalities, other sisters, their comrades, but also the novice mistress who was in charge of them. It was a very powerful position in the convent to be the novice mistress. And they do make comments about the personalities. Some of them speak of it as an intellectual experience, spiritual, a moving experience. That's what I would say, a moving time. So I want to spend more time on that. Here's a very negative assessment, describing the novitiate period as the relentless education that took place daily to transform the behavior of a teenager into the stereotypical behavior of a nun. She's critical. That is not a typical remark about the novitiate. But as I say, I'm going to look into that a little bit more. Anyway, there is much more to these narratives than convent life. I got to tell you, these are very long books. All right? Very long book. I'm like this, and I am not exaggerating, okay? Sometimes the print is big, which I'm grateful for, but they do go on. They have a lot to say. They have a lot to say after all this time. They do. Okay. I'm not good at time. Okay. Almost all discuss their youth and, moreover, emphasize its linked social and religious context in detail. The prominent theme is the centrality of Catholicism in their life as they grew up, and they locate the source of their vocation there. Here's one who explains this one, Mary. She explains she's not going to detail her childhood because she doesn't think non-Catholics could understand it, but she notes how critical it was to her choice of the religious life. There is a background to any story about convent life. That background is the world of First Communions and rosary beads and long masses, prayer books with brightly colored cards. Many of the authors describe the world in terms of, this is a quote, the Catholic Church was the pivot of our lives. I mean, our whole lives wound around the church. That was a social focus for us and the people we knew. A woman describes her pre-convent life as Portuguese Catholic in 1950s America, which pretty much centered around home and church. Another woman remembers family rosaries, frequent mass, and not eating meat on Fridays. Moreover, like many others, she notes that she internalized doing these things and thought they made me a good Catholic girl. In the same vein, another writes, if I didn't perform each ritual, then I was probably disappointing God. Another, faith absorbed me. I soaked in its ornate beauty. I trusted my soul. And notice how much, I found this interesting, how much she liked the physical church. She liked going there and her connection to it. Her father was of an immigrant community and had built it. So she felt a very physical connection to it. Many authors remark on the insularity of this Catholic childhood. One described a close circle of home and church and school. In the chapter she calls immersion, another relates an incident when her sister steered her away from other girls because they're Protestant and we don't play with them. Another writes of her very devout Slovenian family and that she didn't know any Protestants growing up. Several have more complicated religious backgrounds, but when they do, they also stress those as a critical part of their decision to become a sister. There are some mixed marriages, and they talk about the tensions within a household in that. Several of them are raised as Catholics because the non-Catholic parent, had to say when they married that they would raise the children in the church. In comparison to the lengthened discussion most authors devote to their youth, the spiritual call to the convent is shorter. However, it's usually presented as emotional or dramatic and with certainty. Some talk about it as being in their heads from a very young age. Here's one saying, she never asked her father for permission, and she entered as an aspirant, where you really did need to have your parents' permission. I never asked my father because there was a greater force directing me. Another said she felt a call on her communion day. Felt like I was given permission that day to spend my life with God. Another, very emotionally, writes, turning point during a retreat that she attended, where she went out in the mist. It's very moving. She decided God wanted her to become a nun. It was not something I weighed with pros and cons. It was something I had to do. Another says, no, I didn't feel any, calling. It just felt it was meant to be. She described it as that it was just seemed right to her. Many write that they were influenced by a sister, either as a group or one individual. Here's one who's unusual in her characterization. She said she was lured to a convent by a priest to talk with sisters who executed their mission with finesse. That's unusual. It's much more common that they speak very lovingly of the sisters that they were educated by or knew personally and were influenced there. There's someone who explained she was saddened at the thought of leaving the sisters when she graduated from high school. Another sister in my high school showed and influenced me. I shared with her my desire. Another, the sisters were a good example, always helping others. Their conduct was impeccable. I scrutinized their every move. The women authors also often write of telling their family that they were going to become a sister, and often reflect on how difficult that must have been for their parents. Mark and I have talked about this when having a child join a religious community no longer had the cachet that it had in earlier times. And it seems that this era supports that. It's hard on them. When they look back, they say that it must have been so hard for my parents. One writes, when she received the letter accepting her application, although Mom smiles, there is sadness in her eyes. Another mother eventually came to support her daughter's choice because she wanted nothing more than for me to be happy, if entering was what I truly wished to do. But when it was time to say goodbye, she recalls, Mama was not outwardly crying, but I knew that she would have liked to. Another, her father, the night before, looking into his eyes, I saw him fight back the tears. I could go on. There are quite a few of those. Most described entrance day, and that's the day, really, you enter. You knock on the right, you've been told you could come. And most described that day with an assortment of emotions, from extreme anxiety to, joyful anticipation. Here's one. She includes a photo of herself and writes, the smile says, you have no idea what you are getting into. And they talk there about leaving their parents and how difficult that was. There are many references to boyfriends, and specific instances of the boys, the men in their life. Here's one, considered being a sister when she was in high school, but says she put the idea aside because she was still intent on meeting a boy. Another recalls a childhood romance and how she mooned and primped over the guy. Another said she was dating a guy, and one day she dreamed of marrying him and having a passel of kids, but the next day I see myself as a nun teaching someone else's children. Several recount of how they told boyfriends that they were leaving, that they were joining the convent. One notes, her last had trouble getting over her. He drank. Maybe if I had left him for another fellow, it would have been easier and different. Another explains how she and her boyfriend had discussed marriage and how on the eve of his departure for naval boot camp, she told him of her decision. And 3 days later, she was heading off for a boot camp of her own in Waltham, Massachusetts, to prepare for becoming a nun. Another wonders whether the good luck telegram her boyfriend and his mother sent her was actually heartfelt. So they want to make the point that they had lived, this other life, and it included men. All the authors chronicle and discuss their leave-taking for the convent. For some, the decision is recounted as instantaneous. This is what I decided to do. For others, it was a lengthy process. Some say they had doubts from the beginning. It's in the sections where they talk about their lives as a sister that they start to talk about, to be critical of the life. The postulancy, the novitiate, not so much. That's exciting times. It's getting into the work. And I have to say, as I read it, some of it, I read it as the kind of things I complained about in my place of work, particularly for the ones who were teachers, right? But ultimately, all these women obviously decide to leave. One typical quote, "I can't do this anymore." She was a missionary sister of the Sacred Heart. She is one of the few that was published by a mainstream publisher, Doubleday. Another, again, typical, "I felt I wasn't in charge of my life anymore." Often the discussion of leave-taking concludes with emotions and thoughts about what it was like immediately after they left. And those sections describe difficulties, of going into yet another world. Most authors conclude their narratives with how they spent their lives since they left the convent. They're very much the same. I mean, there are a few I call outliers, who went to live on a commune, in Nebraska, maybe. But no, most of them married, worked, had children, and they worked. Many were in the fields that they were trained in as sisters, and they worked in fields that women of their generation, would have worked in. Some remain in the church, and some don't, and some don't say whether they did or not. A number make the point that they keep in touch with their communities and go to reunions. But I would say, with few exceptions, they went on to live lives much like other women in their, cohort, in their demographic cohort. Okay, so that's like a little synopsis of, some of what I've read. So why did they bother to do this? Right? Okay. Why these tomes, after all this? Okay. A lot of them give personal reasons. My kids asked me, my friends asked me. There are a couple that are self-help books. This is what I lived, so maybe this will help you get through a difficult period in your life. But many of them say it took them a very long time to write because they had to process what had happened. They had to think about it, and many of them say it was always there, but I wasn't ready. And frankly, they have the time now, right? And they're of an age, if they're not going to do it now, it's not going to happen. But my feeling is that regardless of their personal reasons, right, they all share the desire, in the words of one, to set the record straight. Let's get this right. And to open a window on a life that was unknown at the time. And even still, right? It was secret. It was secret. And people didn't know what was going on. And they want to get that out there. And I think in doing so, they present a very compelling argument about the attraction of the female religious life in the latter decades in the period surrounding the Second World War. Something I think worth noting. Although these authors express anger about events, and I think I've chosen here, more pleasant, comments, but there are complaints. I mean, they left after all, right? So they do complain. But I wouldn't characterize these as angry books. They're not. Which I would say the ones from the 1970s, a couple of those were. But these are not. I'd say they're more explanatory books. They want to explain. And there are a couple of things, related things that they want to explain. They want to explain the normality of going into the convent, given their background, and that it wasn't a bad decision to go in, and it wasn't a bad decision to leave. And doing both was a choice. They made those decisions to do that. when they explain the intertwining of Catholic family and community, they emphasize that going into the convent was a reasonable decision. Again, some use the word normalcy, normalness, and if they don't, that resounds in others. One said, given my background, how could I not think about, becoming a sister? But one thing I want to say is, as normal as it might have been, they suggest more than that. They don't suggest that they were pushed into it, that this was what I was supposed to do because I was, a good Catholic girl. No, it was a decision. When they write of admiration for sisters they knew, of powerful calls they felt to the religious life, reference the boyfriends that they rejected, they're also arguing for the purposefulness of a decision, that they made, as opposed to an inevitable one that, given their background, was where they ended up. And that's also accurate, I think, in terms of their depiction of discussion of leaving the convent. They emphasize the pain of it. Making that decision was difficult. So there was a purposefulness about that. Overall, they depict very full and meaningful lives. That's what they want to say. That's what they want us to know, I think. Despite the lighthearted titles, you can imagine the alliteration, right? Kicking the habit, is the one that comes to mind. But convent, cloister, it's stuff like that. But they're not fanciful. This is not Trouble with Angels kind of tellings of convent life. And I think they're countering the still frequent depiction of 20th century American nuns as irrelevant, out of touch, and silly. Think of the images. I mean, they're still all over cards. You know how many people send me cards of nuns on roller skates? I have a ton of them, and yeah, nuns did roller skate, but that's, people who have never even known a nun, right? They have an image of, the nun and the habit, and then they're on roller skates. So I would say that, in the words of one author, these life narratives by former sisters, and this is her words, they bear witness to the fact that, and this is her quote, people like us did live, and they ask us to take it seriously, their life seriously. So yes, I got that. We're done.
Thank you. There's a lot of questions. Let me start with two questions.
You get to go start.
Okay. I provided the line, so I get to ask the first question. I have a good friend, Joan Franks, who's a Dominican nun. She's the head of school for Dominican Academy, which is a very, very good Catholic girls' school in Manhattan.
In Manhattan, I've had recent dealings with them because they're having a little situation there.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
But she says that nuns have been trivialized and sentimentalized, so that portrayal of nuns, not only in Sister Act, but in other things as well, the nuns are portrayed as either ditzy, otherworldly, or sort of like so introspective that they're not aware. She says she is a sister. She taught. She has a PhD in philosophy, so she's been in the world. She said none of the nuns that she lived with, and she entered the convent in Columbus, Ohio, were either ditzy or introspective. So the media doesn't know how to portray this. Second question, I always tell my students, the biggest crisis in the American church was caused by the decrease of religious women, because religious women won the vast majority of parochial schools. And when I was growing up, Father McCarthy might have been the pastor of the parish, but you were terrified of Sister Mary Assumpta, because she ran that parish, and she decided who was in the school, who was not in the school. And in a sense, the American Catholic Church has never gotten over this huge decline. So comment on whether you think that nuns have been trivialized.
Oh, well, I definitely think so, and I agree with your friend, and you'll have to connect me with her, because I have a friend who's a trustee there, and I know there's a situation there. Yeah, absolutely. I taught a course on American nuns. It was the last course I taught at Hunter, and I have to tell you, Hunter is a public school in New York City, and there was only one Catholic student, and she was a convert in the class. And we started with what is your image of a nun? Ask me why they took the class. I think it fit in their schedule because, but yeah, that's all they had. Funny things, but really that's the popular culture image of a sister. Absolutely. So I absolutely agree with that. The next question would be, why is that, right? I don't think you priests have quite the same situation there. So why is it? Well, of course, gender has to play into that. But that's a different discussion. And your second point about, what was your second point?
It was about nuns, the drama of nuns affecting Korean Catholics.
Yeah, yes. But, my first work with nuns was about hospitals. And often, the critique was, well, there are no nuns to run the hospitals anymore. And I don't quite agree with that, because they could still be in charge. You know what I mean? Like the ethos and the nunly way of running a hospital can still exist without the nuns being the ones who did all the work. So in terms of schools, I don't know, is there a similar argument, to be made there? And in terms of with your school, that, in some schools, and I've seen this in documentary evidence, the sisters didn't have a lot of control. Just the in the parish where I grew up, and where that Monsignor, clever fellow, he got sisters from a different diocese because he didn't want them connected to the establishment. So they were pretty powerless. So it's just a different model, But yeah, there's in the trenches power, which is, I think, what you're talking about, right? Which is what they have. Yeah.
Question.
I'm still not clear on why they would write, in the sense of were they typically trying to be self-justifying or self-explanatory. It seems a little bit narcissistic to me to dwell on that one's own story to that extent, and to what purpose and what end. And I'm just wondering, is there anything comparable by way of history or historical narratives for people who left priesthood?
Well, all right, a couple of things. I think, yes, writing a memoir, you do have to have a certain ego about you, that you think what you have to say in your life is worth the telling. No, in terms of something comparable, you're onto something there. Because I have done, and this is, it's somewhat anecdotal. What other group? I mean, this is a group, right? There are a lot of these women. This is not one or two, right, that are deciding to do this. As I said, it's age might be why they're doing it now. But I don't know of another cohort, right, who feels that, I can think of one, celebrities, right? But celebrities have a built-in audience. Everybody wants to know so-and-so's life, No, I think age is partially the reason they're doing it now, but they want their story out there. I wouldn't diminish them in terms of being so selfish about it, because when you read the memoirs, the difficulties of the writing of it come through too. They're often they'll say, for example, haven't thought about this, but and reflect. And I think it gets to Mark's point. They're doing it because of what people have said to them, or what they see around them as what nuns were, and they want to say, no, this is not what nuns were. It's not what I was. It's not what I was.
Yeah, Dr. McCauley, I'm wondering, it's basically the same age cohort of women that coming into becoming nuns in the late 50s and into the 60s, and then in the 60s and early 70s was the Great Leaving and a very tumultuous time in the general society. I'm wondering if you said a number of books, 8 or 10 were published fairly close in that era, and many of the others are more recent.
Right.
Do you see differences? You mentioned some of the earlier ones show anger, but are there different memories? Are there different reasons? One group is looking back,
Right.
50 years. The other group is writing contemporaneously.
Right.
And do you
That's a good question. Yes, I do. The earlier, let's call them the 70s group,
okay.
they're much more focused on the leave taking. There's not as much contextualization in terms of their families. These new ones, they really spend a lot of time on their families. I mean, the names of the siblings, their ages, they create that world for their reader. They want that information out there. That is not in the later ones, the earlier ones, I'm sorry, which are much more of the moment, and as I said, angrier. What else could I say about those? They're more, they spend more time on the specific reason and the events surrounding that particular reason. Yeah. And those are mainstream publishers. So they had direction, in terms of what the American public, a very dear friend of mine edited one. And I said, Jane, in Elizabeth Upton's book, did you tell her to put all that sex in? And she laughed. Because that's the public, right? Yeah.
That's what sells.
That's what sells. Yeah, exactly.
A question about how these memoirs would relate to, I guess, any sisters leaving more within the 21st century. I'm thinking this is just a word of mouth story of a woman who was looking into becoming a nun. She talks with them and discerns, and then they end up telling her to go back, discern some more. Then she's like, I'm certain I want to do this, and they reject her, and so she had to kind of figure that out. Is the process of that different? I guess.
Well, the communities have become, I don't know what the word would be. Let's just say they don't take people as easily as they had in the past.
Of these stories in some regard, or is there a different
Well, I
reason
think
for
partially it's financial. They don't want to educate them. They can't afford to educate them, I should say it that way. They can't afford to. Some communities, the Sisters of Charity of New York, a group that I've worked extensively with, they took a vote last year. They're not taking any more new members. So the education of a nun and the process that these authors describe, is longer. Yeah, and that doesn't surprise me that someone would be told, go back and think about it again. Yeah. I know. I think I know who you're talking about. She has, she's on YouTube. There's a woman who's on YouTube who talks about, and she is a sister, but you can call into her, or people do call into her, but, and, they don't, it's different now, the mother houses, well, communities now consolidate, and train. Which that's something else. What so many of these women write about, the rituals and customs, which were unique to their group, and it created as a culture of that particular group. So I wonder how they do that when they're training a Sister of Mercy, a missionary Sister of the Sacred Heart. It's very different. The cultures are different.
Thank you for your presentation. I am curious about if you've discovered in your research, aside from people just feeling like the life in the convent or life as a sister was just not the right fit for them, have you noticed any like social or cultural trends as to the reasons that the reasons the women are giving for why they leave, or like the trends in how they describe the leaving?
I would say that the most frequent explanation is that they found that the life was no longer relevant. And the biggest complaint is that it was based on a model that didn't work in the contemporary world. Yeah. I do look to see when outside events, people, in my lists of things that I've noted, and very few, not a lot of references to the Vietnam War, JFK, yes, I would say that would be, and Vatican II, but no, it's more the life, if you see what I mean, that it isn't relevant to what they see around them. Yeah.
Were they more like the 70s group? Did they find that there were more rules confining them compared to the later groups? As far as their social.
No, they each speaks of it. But I would say, to get it, your point, the 70s group is much more concerned with the outside world. They talk much more about the outside world and their decision than the later group.
I'm sorry to jump in again. I took a course a number of years ago with Bob Worsey, who's teaching a course on nuns, and he was suggesting that for a long time to be a nun was an elevated status. You could be a nurse, you could be a teacher, and those were important roles. Suddenly, as women more came into the workforce, you could do that on a secular basis, and there were more opportunities for women on a secular basis, and that's what he was arguing was.
Yeah, I think that would be true in terms of entering, but not leaving. I wouldn't say that these women left because they could be the CEO of Coca-Cola.
Yeah.
Because what they did was they continued what they were trained, and that was their era. They did what their sisters did, what the girls that they went to school with did.
Mm-hmm.
I think I have one or two who said something about the Peace Corps. Oh, if I had known about the Peace Corps, maybe that would have been something, for me. But you had your hand.
Yeah, so I was thinking also that I would think more of them would have said that the loss of control over their life, as far as making choices and that kind of thing, that would have been an issue. And also that I grew up with Catholic nuns, Mercy nuns in Western New York, and there is the other stereotype of the strict nun that hit your knuckles with the ruler, and so I don't know if any of them fit into that category because
they don't admit to it.
Yeah, they're not because it was very strict, and they ran the classroom, and you didn't step out of line, and heaven forbid that the nuns call your parents.
Their power. They had power in their own classroom.
Well, if you have, has anybody here teach you at 50 kids in a classroom?
Unbelievable.
Yeah, 50 fourth graders. Woo, not easy. But to get to that image, I think that this gets to Mark's friend's point about the image, and I think that how can I say this? That we as Catholics, those of us, if I speak for us. It's been a lot of characterizations of that. When I was in school, I saw the nun, push kids' head against the wall, and there's been a promotion of that, which also is very demeaning, So it's like either this taskmaster, or there's, the roller skater, But where, as Mark's friend said, I didn't know either of those. This is my reality is,
I saw a calendar. There's a group of very conservative nuns in Nashville, and there's a calendar of nuns doing nuns roller skating, nuns playing volleyball, I thought,
Yeah.
It's really demeaning.
It is demeaning. Yes, it really is.
It
Yeah.
feels, you know, what they project is that they have no control to do anything but what they're told to do.
Exactly.
You know, and and I think most of us have seen priests jump in their car and take off without any, you know, nobody's telling them that they can't. But I never saw a nun get in her car and leave.
You know, I gave a talk at Hunter when my hospital book came out. Usually, you know, they have somebody from the sciences who brings in a big research grant talk. But my friends were in the library, and they said, no, they were going to have me talk. So I gave my, you know, and I have a very favorable interpretation of Catholic nuns organizing the Catholic health care system. I mean, I'm not going to apologize for that. I think they did a damn good job. And somebody stood up and just went nuts about, well, what about, and he starts in on the nuns, you know, and whipping and this and that. I was really taken aback. But before I could say a word, Sister Rita Nowatzki, who had heard about my talk and is a Sister of Charity of New York, stood up. She was there, okay? And she said, excuse me, I'm a Sister of Charity of New York, and I never hit a child. And I went, oh, thank you. Okay, you know. But, you know, where did that come from, right? You know, but he would have just gone on, and I think people would say, oh, yeah, because there is that too. Those are the two stereotypes, you know, that exist. And, okay, I'm not a cultural person, I don't do cultural history, but stereotypes do come from something. I mean, we all know that. But then they get out of control. They spin out of control. So. Okay.
Please join me in thanking Bunny.
Well, you have one more question.